Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Jonathan Hunt. Jonathan is a Title VIII research scholar with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and he's working on an interesting project here called Atomic Condominium, the Soviet Union, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty 1958 to 1970. Jonathan, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us about the project. What are you looking at?
So I'm looking at a sort of period of time really from the long 1960s, if you can call it that, beginning in 1958 with the Second Taiwan Straits Crisis, instigated by, of course, Mao Zedong of the People's Republic of China, and culminating really in the finalization and the opening for signature and then entry into force of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, with the exception of the UN Charter, is the most widely adhered to international compact in history. And so trying to understand the roots of not only this kind of bilateral superpower bargain between the United States and the Soviet Union, but also how they managed to convince so many of the world's nation states to join a pact that was really inherently discriminatory, that set up and established a kind of two-tier international system.
In that you have the nukes, you get to keep them, you don't, forget about it.
More or less, yeah. A very arbitrary date, essentially, January 1st, 1967. If you had tested before then, you were consecrated as a nuclear weapons state with all the rights and privileges thereof. And if you had not, then it was, in fact, illegal if you joined this treaty to either receive them or produce them yourself.
Are you far enough down the path in your research to start to draw some conclusions about how this was pulled off?
I think so. Yeah, it's been both a wild ride and also, any time that you're reading essentially these international negotiations, there's a lot of you could say sort of, dead air in the negotiations, a lot of setting out positions that are fairly well known, while negotiations are actually happening sort of behind closed doors or in the corridors of places like the UN headquarters in New York or the various UN buildings in Geneva, also, among these various capitals. So there's kind of a variety of conclusions I've come to, diplomatic conclusions about how they actually managed to pull this off. Geopolitical conclusions, what were the interests at stake for the major stakeholders in the treaty. And then lastly, historically, what do we make of this? It doesn't fit neatly into our narratives of the Cold War as this geo-ideological struggle between the communist world and the capitalist world. In fact, this is a moment of what international relations scholars would call world building, in which these two seemingly antithetical empires or superpowers, depending on which term you prefer, came to some kind of tacit agreement that there would be certain rules of the road for their international competition.
Yeah, the opposite of war and the Cold War construction.
Yeah, very much. This is really a story of diplomatic success, not just bilateral, but in fact a global, a form of global governance that persists till this day.
Is it as simple as the fact that the stakes are so incredibly high when you're talking about nuclear war that the motivation is also high?
Well, there's certainly a sobering effect at play. But I think there was also a way in which the superpowers use this issue, which is indisputably consequential. I mean, it's especially given the effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were well known, of course, by the time you get into the 1950s. But also, this is in the 1950s up into the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, an era of atmospheric nuclear testing that really put a lot of fear in the hearts of citizens around the world. It was a way for the superpowers to present themselves as responsible world leaders. Despite their differences, especially their differences in what used to be called the Third World, in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, there was common ground, and that common ground had to do with a vision of human progress driven by technological development, and the fact that nuclear technology had peaceful but also military uses was really something that they had to resolve in order for people to continue to believe in that.
How did that work at the height of tensions in the Cold War, where the surface debate and rhetoric and competition were fairly heated, and yet below the surface there was sort of this steady as she goes approach to nuclear negotiations?
Yeah, that's right. And I think something that the two sides did very well was, especially once you get into the 1960s, keeping essentially the channels of communication open. And so this is perhaps most famously illustrated during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you have talks in the Soviet embassy, somewhat secretly, between Attorney General Robert Kennedy and the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The fact that Kennedy and Khrushchev have this ongoing correspondence, a correspondence that would really continue throughout the rest of the Cold War, and probably culminating with Gorbachev and Reagan's correspondence in the 1980s. But the two sides did not necessarily see eye to eye immediately, and it took that sort of process of mutual learning for them to define through, game theorists might call this a sort of iterative game of kind of testing the other side's limits. But the Cuban Missile Crisis shows them that introducing nuclear weapons into a revolutionary context, the revolutionary context of Cuba, which under Fidel Castro was not only trying to ward off an American intervention to reverse that revolution, but also to export that revolution throughout the Caribbean basin. Khrushchev's notion was, well, if we introduce Soviet-owned nuclear weapons, intermediate and medium-range ballistic missiles, but also tactical nuclear weapons, cruise missiles, really kind of the whole arsenal of Soviet nuclear capabilities. This would, in essence, ensure that these lines were respected, that the United States would not invade. And, he probably had good reason to believe, well, the United States has done the exact same thing. Kennedy and his advisors, they recognized during the executive committee meetings in 1962, that essentially the Soviets had taken a page from their own book. They had placed American nuclear weapons in Turkey, right on the border of the Soviet Union, in Italy and in the United Kingdom, within striking distance of Moscow. And so we see, again, this sort of combination of what are these generalizable principles that we can come to through international diplomacy, but also the respect for spheres of influence, that events in the Caribbean were going to just mean more. There's a balance of resolve on the side of the United States, and the same was true for Central Europe, for the Soviet Union. Ultimately, Moscow found it in their best interest to work with the United States to ensure that, at the very least, those nuclear weapons that were pointed at them were only under the authority of one decision-making center, Washington.
You made the point that this is an enduring agreement.
Yeah.
And if you fast forward to today and try to define what is the relationship between Russia and the former Soviet capital and the United States and the West, some people have invoked the Cold War terminology and said we're in a second Cold War. What do you think?
Well, I think that's where the Cold War as a historical period is somewhat, in its own definition, problematic. It leaves out as much as it includes. And part of, I think, the reason I gravitated towards this subject is that it cut against the grain of most Cold War history, that this is a story of cooperation, a cooperation that has persisted. So
it's counterintuitive to the main narrative.
It is, and that's where, whether we're talking about a Cold War, a second Cold War with Russia, or we're talking about a new Cold War with the People's Republic of China, even during the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War, there was cooperation, especially on issues that had either transnational or, in fact, planetary implications. Nuclear weapons foremost among them, but you could say the same about international terrorism. You could say the same, to a certain extent, less so today, about international trade. And so determining where that competition can and cannot proceed is a big part of understanding the Cold War, but also the post-Cold War context.
If you take two contemporary examples now of potential nuclear proliferation, whether it's Iran or North Korea,
yes,
is the cooperation between the United States, Russia, and others at a better level now than it was then, or was it actually better during the so-called Cold War?
So that's interesting. One thing that I would like to point out with this book is originally most of, I don't want to call them the culprits necessarily, but those states that were most likely to acquire nuclear weapons, and for their part most likely through their own internal research and development, were U.S. allies. And this is rather intuitive when you recognize that U.S. allies were, for the most part, the most advanced industrial countries on the planet. They were Japan, they were West Germany. France and the United Kingdom, of course, developed nuclear weapons in the 1950s. And there were a lot of concerns that West Germany would follow in their lead, that Japan would follow in their lead. And when you look at a map, it's quite clear that these two countries, they don't border the United States. They border the Soviet Union along with other neighbors. And so in some ways, the United States found themselves in a mediating position. And part of the reason I've used the term condominium, ever so slightly ironically, is at first, this was very much a treaty and a sort of an agreement that was in Moscow's interests. They were essentially looking to the United States to rein their own allies in. Not just Japan and West Germany, but also Israel, South Africa, Brazil, all of which were playing really big roles in those regions' own Cold Wars. So at that point, the United States played this sort of, and it still does, but even more so in the 1960s, this really, you might call it a hegemonic role in the international system. And that shifted somewhat. The relative power of the United States has declined from about 50% of the world's economy to about a quarter. That said, the potential nuclear proliferators have also changed. It's no longer yet. We still keep an eye out on West Germany and Japan. They have the capability to develop nuclear weapons in very short order. Both of them have world-leading nuclear energy complexes, although West Germany has started to transition away from it. But our concerns now are more with these rogue states. And the original rogue state was the People's Republic of China. They tested an atomic device in 1964, a thermonuclear device in 1967. And both the United States and the Soviet Union really tried to find a way to either avert or discourage or limit the PRC's nuclear capability, and they found that to be a hard case they could never quite solve. And I think we see the same dynamic today with North Korea and Iran, both of whom are somewhat outside of the international economic system, both of whom have demonstrated their willingness to flout sort of the international rules of the road, to flout American power. And so while there is grounds for cooperation, again, Iran borders former Soviet republics, North Korea borders Russia, there is common ground geopolitically to work together. But I think we're seeing a combination of a couple of different dynamics. The first of which is the rise of unilateralism in American foreign policy. This was the case from 2001 to 2009. It tracks somewhat with partisan foreign policy and domestic policy trends, but it's nonetheless very clearly something that the international community, both allied and adversarial and partners, have had to deal with. What does cooperation look like when Washington feels as if it can go its own way? And then the second, of course, are other irritants, if not major impediments to U.S.-Russian cooperation today.
The fundamental question always asked in discussions of nuclear weapons: are we safer now than whenever the marker is? You know, the people who are still alive remember well duck and cover in their elementary school or school days, and remember things like, I think it was back in the 70s, there was the TV show that got massive ratings the morning after, the day after, about what if nuclear war had happened.
John Lithgow, I believe, famously in Lawrence, Kansas. So anybody who graduate, all Jayhawks remember, the day after, very,
But that sort of mindset where the potential of nuclear war, anyone who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis that you've already referenced, that anyone who lived through that, they had this sort of mentality that this was this slow burn in the back of their brains, this buzz, the possibility. We seem to have moved far beyond that. It's not a thing that people talk about, certainly young people today. Are they ignoring a still clear threat, or is that in some ways the legacy of this surprising cooperation during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union?
Yeah, no, I think that's very perceptive. And I'd make a couple of comments. The first is that it's disappeared, certainly I think, in elite domestic politics conversations. And so there was a lot of conversation during the last Democratic debate that no questions were asked about nuclear weapons, whether nuclear proliferation or the end of a number of arms control agreements between the United States and Russia, most notably the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. That just doesn't seem to come up. Other issues, other sort of global, seemingly existential issues such as climate change seem to have pushed that off the debate stage. Simultaneously, young people are more concerned about rising oceans and their carbon footprint than they necessarily are about the spread of nuclear weapons, in part because they feel as if they can actually do something. I mean, this is crazy to say that climate change actually seems like a more treatable problem than nuclear weapons, in part because nuclear weapons have always been packaged as really the concern of international elites, international leaders. This is something you talk about at a summit. It's not something that your consumer
recycling doesn't help with nuclear weapons.
Right. So the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has its infamous Doomsday Clock. And essentially, the position of the minute hand is supposed to signal our proximity to doomsday. I would say, in a number of ways, we live in a less risky nuclear world than the 1960s. There are far fewer nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, there are more fingers on the proverbial trigger, on the button. So trying to make sense of that, is this riskier? Is it less riskier? Less risky. I would say it's perhaps more risky because we have somewhat taken our eye off the ball on this issue. But on the other hand, I think the overall sense of the place of nuclear deterrence in the international system is somewhat more baked in. There's a fair amount of kind of knowledge, and not just self-knowledge, but knowledge that potential adversaries sort of agree that nuclear weapons serve the role of discouraging conflict rather than waging war.
Being tools of conflict.
Right. But again, there are signs that is starting to break down as well, even in the United States. That was a major progenitor of that world.
So I have to ask you the question all authors get asked: when will we see the book?
Yeah, I mean,
don't want to sound like your book agent.
No, I mean it's the question my parents ask me pretty much every other day. So, I'm currently I spent the summer here at the Kennan Institute finishing chapter 4, which is.
And how has it been working here on the book?
It's fantastic. This is a wonderful, in my opinion, probably the best repository of area studies knowledge in the United States, if not the world. It's a fantastic place to work, to have pretty much immediate access to any book that's ever been published has been wonderful, and the research assistance that's provided here as well has been amazing. The interns who work at the Wilson Center really are the best. So I've spent the summer finishing the 4th chapter, which really focuses on the Kennedy administration. How do we get from sort of early confrontation, not just in Cuba, but in Southeast Asia, over China and its role in exporting revolution, to the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which is this important antecedent to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There's a reason that the definition of a nuclear weapon state is whether or not you've tested a nuclear weapon before this date in 1967, and that's established, that norm is established by the Limited Test Ban Treaty. So I'm hoping, finishing the introduction now, I'll have a conclusion left to go, send it out to presses probably in the next 2 months, and then hope to see the book out in a year or two.
Very exciting.
Yes.
Well, thank you for giving us a preview today, and when the book's out, let's talk again about it.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Jonathan Hunt, pleasure to meet you. Thanks for today's discussion. Hope you enjoyed it as well, and that you'll join us again soon for another edition of Wilson Center Now. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.